December 19th, 1943. The air in Campo Mori hung thick with the smell of salt water and rotting fish. Thomas Brennan pressed his back against the rough wooden slats of the barracks wall, feeling each ridge dig into his spine through the threadbare cotton of his prison uniform. His ribs showed through the fabric now, all of them, like keys on a xylophone. He'd stopped counting how many pounds he'd lost after the first month. Outside, the winter wind cut across Tokyo Bay with a cruelty that seemed personal. Thomas could hear it whistling through gaps in the walls, carrying with it the industrial groan of the shipyard across the water. The sound never stopped. Day and night, the machinery churned, building the instruments of war while men like him wasted away in their shadow. He closed his eyes and tried to remember warmth, real warmth, not the fever heat that came with dysentery or the false promise of huddling with other prisoners for body heat. He tried to contentional develature. Remember his mother's kitchen in Sacramento, the way afternoon sunlight would pour through the window above the sink, turning everything golden. The memory felt like something that had happened to someone else, in some other life. Brennan. The whisper came from his left. Eddie Sullivan, a Marine from Boston who'd been captured on Wake Island, shifted closer. His face was all angles now, cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper. "The new guard's watching you." Thomas opened his eyes and scanned the compound yard through the doorway. Sure enough, across the frozen mud and past the roll call platform, a young Japanese guard stood at attention near the fence. He couldn't have been more than 20. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, were fixed directly on their barracks. "They're all watching," Thomas muttered. "That's their job." "No, I mean really watching. Third time today. He's got a look about him." Eddie's voice dropped even lower, like he's studying us, memorizing faces. A chill ran down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the December cold. In 6 months at Omori, he'd learned to read the guards the way a sailor reads the sky. You had to. Your life depended on knowing which ones would beat you for looking up and which ones would beat you for looking down. Which ones swung their rifle butts when drunk, and which ones did it stone sober. This new guard, the prisoners had started calling him the Scholar. Because of the way he observed everything didn't fit any pattern Thomas knew. The Scholar never raised his voice, never struck anyone, never even drew his rifle. But his presence felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. You knew the drop was there, waiting. "Maybe he's just green," Thomas offered, though he didn't believe it. "Fresh from training. Green guards hit hardest," Eddie said. "Wisdom earned through too many beatings. Trying to prove something. But this one," he trailed off, shaking his head. The sharp blast of a whistle cut through their conversation. Tenko. Roll call. Time to stand in the freezing mud while guards counted them like inventory, making sure none of their precious prisoners had died in the night without permission. Thomas pushed himself to his feet, joints popping in protest. Around him, 47 other men rose from their bunks, the ones who could still walk on their own. 3 more lay motionless in the corner, too sick to stand. The guards knew about them. Sometimes they counted them anyway, sometimes they didn't. The inconsistency was almost worse than the brutality. You never knew which rules would apply on which day. They shuffled outside into the gray December morning. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater, heavy with clouds that promised snow but never delivered. The ground was frozen mud, hard as concrete, and just as unforgiving under Thomas's bare feet. His boots had rotted through 2 months ago. The guards had laughed when he'd asked for replacements. The prisoners formed their lines 5 rows of 10, with the 3 dying men absent from the back row. The gaps in the formation looked like missing teeth. Colonel Watanabe emerged from the guardhouse, his boots clicking against the wooden platform. The Weasel, they called him, though never where he could hear. Small, compact, with a face that seemed permanently twisted in disgust. He'd been a schoolteacher before the war, someone had heard. Now he taught lessons in obedience, and the curriculum involved fists and rifle butts, and standing at attention until men collapsed. But today, Colonel Watanabe wasn't alone. The Scholar stood beside him, notepad in hand, watching the prisoners with that same intense, analytical gaze. Thomas fixed his eyes on the fence line behind the platform, not on the guards, never on the guards, and waited for the count to begin. The count took 17 minutes. 17 minutes of standing motionless while frostbite at Thomas's bare feet and the wind found every gap in his uniform. 17 minutes while Colonel Watanabe prowled the lines looking for infractions. A man swaying was an infraction. A man coughing was an infraction. A man whose face showed too much defiance or too much despair was an infraction. When the weasel finally returned to his platform and dismissed them with a curt bark in Japanese, Thomas's feet had gone numb. He stumbled slightly as the formation broke and felt Eddie's hand steady him. "Easy," Eddie whispered. "Don't give them a reason." But as they turned toward the barracks, a sharp command froze them in place. Colonel Watanabe was pointing directly at their section, his finger jabbing the air like a knife. Then he was striding toward them, and Thomas's stomach dropped because he knew with absolute certainty that something terrible was about to happen. The weasel stopped in front of a prisoner 3 men down from Thomas. Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco who'd been caught in the Philippines. Chen was older, maybe 40, with gray threading through his black hair. He'd been a professor before the war. Now he worked 16-hour shifts at the shipyard, his hands wrapped in rags because the guards wouldn't issue gloves. Colonel Watanabe spoke rapid Japanese, his voice rising with each syllable. Chen stood rigid, eyes forward, giving no response. That was the rule. Stay silent unless directly ordered to speak. But Thomas could see Chen's jaw tightening, could see the tension climbing his neck like mercury in a thermometer. The weasel struck him across the face. The crack echoed across the compound. Chen's head snapped to the side, but his feet didn't move. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Another barrage of Japanese, another strike. This time Chen staggered. Thomas's hands balled into fists at his sides, fingernails digging crescents into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to do something, to stop this. But moving meant death. Interfering meant execution, and probably execution for Eddie and half the barracks too. The guards had made that clear after Johnny MacArthur had tried to help a friend during a beating. They'd shot Johnny and made everyone watch. So Thomas stood and watched and hated himself for it. The beating went on. Methodical, educational. Colonel Watanabe was teaching a lesson, though no one including Chen knew what the lesson was supposed to be. Maybe Chen had worked too slowly. Maybe he'd worked too quickly. Maybe he'd looked at a guard wrong or failed to bow deep enough or committed some invisible crime against the unknowable rules that governed their lives. Chen went down to his knees. The weasel kicked him in the ribs. Once, twice. The dull thud of boot against bone made Thomas's stomach turn. And then something unexpected happened. The scholar stepped forward. He didn't touch Colonel Watanabe and didn't speak loudly, but he said something quiet, urgent Japanese that Thomas couldn't understand and placed himself between the weasel and the kneeling prisoner. The entire compound seemed to hold its breath. Guards didn't intervene. Ever. The hierarchy was absolute. To question a superior's actions was to invite dishonor, punishment, maybe worse. But the scholar stood his ground, his young face grave, his eyes meeting Colonel Watanabe's without flinching. For a long moment, nothing moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel Eddie's breathing beside him quicken with tension. Then Colonel Watanabe spat something sharp and dismissive, turned on his heel, and marched back to the guardhouse. The scholar watched him go, then crouched beside Chen, helping the older man to his feet with surprising gentleness. Chen swayed, blood running from his nose and mouth. The scholar steadied him, said something low in English, just 2 words that carried across the frozen morning air. "I'm sorry." Then he released Chen and returned to his post, face carefully neutral, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The temperature in the barracks had dropped below freezing, and men huddled together for warmth, but Thomas lay awake on his wooden bunk, staring at the ceiling shadows cast by moonlight through the gaps in the walls. "I'm sorry." The words kept echoing in his head. In 6 months, he'd never heard a guard apologize. He'd heard them laugh, curse, threaten, command. He'd heard them sing while drunk and pray while sober, but never an apology, never an acknowledgement that what they were doing was wrong. "You awake?" Eddie's whisper cut through the darkness. "Yeah. What do you think that was about? With the new guard?" Thomas shook his head, even though Eddie couldn't see it. "I don't know. Maybe he's just different. Different gets you killed in a place like this, on either side of the fence." That was the truth of it, wasn't it? The guards who showed mercy didn't last long. They got transferred or disciplined or simply disappeared. The system didn't reward compassion. It rewarded cruelty, consistency, and the willingness to treat prisoners as less than human. So why had the scholar intervened? The question gnawed at Thomas all through the next day. At the shipyard, where he hauled steel plates until his shoulders screamed. At the mess line, where watery rice gruel sloshed into his bowl. At evening tenko, where he stood in formation while Colonel Watanabe counted them with barely concealed disgust. The scholar was there too, always watching, but he never met Thomas's eyes, never acknowledged that anything unusual had occurred. 3 days passed. The temperature dropped further. 2 more men died, one from pneumonia, one from dysentery. The guards hauled their bodies away without ceremony. 2 more empty spaces in the formation. On the 4th day, Chen collapsed during afternoon. Roll call. He just went down, like a puppet with cut strings. One moment standing, the next lying in the frozen mud, body convulsing. The fever had taken him, it was obvious in the way his skin had gone gray, the way his eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Colonel Watanabe observed with the expression of a man watching something mildly annoying. He turned to order the body dragged away, clearly assuming Chen was dead or close enough that it didn't matter. But the scholar was already moving. He dropped to his knees beside Chen, pressing fingers to the man's neck, checking for a pulse. Then he looked up at Colonel Watanabe and spoke in rapid Japanese, his voice urgent. The weasel's response was a sharp bark that needed no translation. "Leave him." The scholar didn't move. He stayed crouched beside Chen, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the compound with surprising force. He wasn't shouting, but every word was clear, deliberate, weighted with something that might have been defiance or might have been desperation. Colonel Watanabe's face went purple. He stormed across the frozen ground, rifle raised, and for a moment Thomas was certain he was about to witness an execution. Not Chen's, the scholar's. But the young guard didn't flinch. He stayed beside the unconscious prisoner, one hand resting on Chen's shoulder, and when he looked up at his commanding officer, there were tears streaming down his face. Not rage tears, not fear tears. Something else. Something that looked like anguish. The scholar spoke again, voice breaking, and this time Thomas caught one word repeated over and over. Ningen. He didn't know Japanese, but Eddie did a little, picked up from before the war. "Human," Eddie whispered beside him. "He's saying human." Colonel Watanabe stood over the scholar for what felt like an eternity. The entire compound had gone silent. 200 prisoners, 30 guards, all frozen in place, watching this impossible confrontation unfold. When the weasel finally spoke, his voice was ice. He gestured sharply toward the guardhouse, then at Chen, then back at the scholar. An order, unmistakable. The scholar rose slowly to his feet. He bowed deep, formal, the kind of bow that acknowledged complete submission. Then he bent, lifted Chen into his arms with surprising strength for someone so young and slight, and carried him toward the medical barracks. It was barely a medical barracks, really. Just another wooden structure with a few cots and whatever supplies the guards felt like providing, which was almost nothing. But it was warm, and there was a stove, and sometimes the prisoner who'd been a doctor before the war could work small miracles with almost nothing. Colonel Watanabe watched the scholar go, his expression unreadable. Then he dismissed the formation with a disgusted wave and stalked back to his quarters. Thomas didn't see the scholar for 2 days after that. Rumors spread through the compound like wildfire. He'd been arrested. He'd been executed. He'd been transferred. He'd committed suicide to preserve his honor after such public insubordination. But on the third morning, he appeared again at roll call, standing at attention beside Colonel Watanabe as if nothing had happened. There were new bruises on his face, though, purple and yellow shadows around his jaw and eye, and he stood with the careful stiffness of someone whose ribs hurt with every breath. They'd beaten him. Of course they had, but they'd let him live. Chen lived too. He appeared at roll call a week later, thin as a skeleton, leaning on Eddie for support. His eyes found the scholar across the compound, and something passed between them, a nod, barely perceptible, but weighted with meaning. The winter deepened. January arrived with snow that actually stuck to the ground, coating the compound in white that turned gray-brown within hours. The work continued. Men died. More than usual. The cold was claiming them faster than disease. But something had shifted. Thomas couldn't quite define it, but he felt it. Small things. The scholar distributed the morning rice rations and gave slightly fuller portions to the sickest prisoners when Colonel Watanabe wasn't watching. The scholar accidentally left a warehouse door open so prisoners could duck inside for a few minutes of shelter from the wind. The scholar turned his back when a prisoner pocketed an extra blanket. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would get anyone executed, but enough, just barely enough. Other guards noticed. Thomas saw them watching the scholar with confusion, suspicion, sometimes contempt. But the scholar kept his face neutral, kept his posture perfect, and kept performing his duties with mechanical precision. Only his eyes gave him away dark and sad and unbearably human. February brought a thaw. The snow melted into slush, and with it came the smell of the bay, sharp and salty. And one morning, during the count, the scholar wasn't there. Transferred, Eddie reported that night, information gathered through the grapevine of prisoners who worked in the admin building. Sent to a camp up north, Hokkaido. Middle of nowhere. Punishment? Thomas asked. Probably. Or maybe they just wanted him away from us, away from witnesses. Thomas lay awake that night, thinking about the young guard who'd cried, who'd said, "I'm sorry," and human, and put his own life at risk for prisoners he'd been trained to hate, who'd paid for his compassion with bruises and exile. He wondered if the scholar would survive the war, if he'd make it home to whatever family waited for him in whatever village or city had produced a young man capable of weeping for his enemies. He wondered if any of them would survive. April 26, 1945. The air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo, and American B-29s painted the sky with contrails and fire. Camp Omori shook with distant explosions, and for the first time in 2 years, Thomas Brennan felt something like hope. The war was turning. Everyone could feel it. The guards were nervous now, snapping at shadows, their authority crumbling along with Japan's empire. Colonel Watanabe had disappeared 3 weeks ago, fled before war crimes charges could catch him, the prisoners whispered. In August, the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In September, American troops liberated Omori. Thomas walked out of that camp weighing 93 pounds, his body a map of scars and his mind a warehouse of nightmares. Eddie walked out beside him, and Chen and 47 others who'd survived. The scholar never returned. Thomas never learned his real name, never discovered what happened to him after his transfer north. Maybe he survived. Maybe he didn't. The war consumed so many people, reduced them to statistics, to gaps in photographs, to stories without endings. But sometimes, in the years that followed, when Thomas was back in Sacramento with his mother's kitchen full of golden afternoon light, he would remember that morning in December. He would remember a young guard crouching beside a beaten prisoner, tears on his face, saying words that acknowledged their shared humanity in a place designed to deny it. He would remember that even in the machinery of war, even in a system built on cruelty and dehumanization, individual moments of compassion could break through. They didn't change everything. They didn't stop the war, or empty the camps, or bring back the dead. But they mattered. They proved that choice still existed, even in places where choice seemed impossible. That mercy could survive, even in soil specifically designed to kill it. Thomas never forgot the scholar, never forgot the cost the young guard had paid for recognizing prisoners as human beings. And whenever someone asked him about the war, what it taught him, what he carried from it, he told them about that day. The day the guard cried, the day compassion broke through in a place designed to destroy it. The day someone chooses kindness, even when kindness means suffering. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold chapters of World War II history. Share where you're watching from. Let's prove these stories still echo across the world. Because remembering these moments, these choices, these small acts of humanity in humanity's darkest hours, that's how we honor both the prisoners who endured and the rare souls who dared to show them mercy, even at great personal cost.